I would like to call to order the Performance Administration and Finance Committee meeting of the North County Transit District for May 8th, 1923. Before we begin, I would like to inform members of the public who may be viewing the meeting on the district's YouTube page that in order to make a public comment during the meeting, you must connect to the meeting using the Zoom link provided on the agenda. You must also register with the clerk by sending an email to clerk@nctd.org with a name and/or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. I will ask Sohail Rodriguez, Clerk of the Board, to call the roll.
Thank you, Committee Chair. Committee Member Weiss.
Here.
Committee Member Drucker.
Here.
Committee Vice Chair Jenkins.
Here.
Committee Board Alternate Luna.
Here.
That completes the roll.
Sohail, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, there are. There was a revision made to the PowerPoint for item number 2 on the agenda. It was sent to the committee ahead of the meeting and posted on the NCTD website for public consumption.
Thank you. Sohail, do we have any public comments?
We do not.
At this time, we are ending the public registration to speak under general public comment. Before we get into specific items on the agenda for this meeting, I would like to outline meeting protocols to make this meeting as efficient as possible. First, please hold your comments and/or questions until after the agenda item has been presented. Second, when the item comes for board member comments or questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you in the order received. Our first item on the agenda is an overview of the proposed fiscal year 2024 operating and capital budget. A proposed budget update is presented annually to the PAF Committee and then taken to the full board for consideration and adoption in June. Un Park Lynch, Chief Financial Officer, will be reviewing this item. We're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, PAF committee members. I will be presenting today our proposed budget for this coming fiscal year, for fiscal year 2024, as well as our capital program. To provide some background, the district has performed a few of preceding activities preceding this meeting. On March 7th, the executive committee received the executive director's guidance on the proposed budget, as well as the strategic areas of focus. On March 16th, the board set a public hearing for June 15 for adoption and public hearing of our capital and operating budget. On April 24th, the Marketing, Service Planning, and Business Development Committee received the fiscal year 2024 service implementation plan, as well as the assumption and forecast supporting that service plan. And on May 8th and May 11th, our NCTD will publish the notices that NCTD will hold a public hearing on June 15 for consideration of the operating and capital budgets. So before we drill into the numbers, providing some budget considerations that provide some of the framework for the budget that I will be presenting. To get started first, if the board members recall, back on April 22nd, 2021, the board approved the proposed new rail operations and facilities maintenance business model, which entailed transitioning insourcing in-house rail operations and maintenance, as well as right-of-way maintenance of signals and facilities. The first phase of the insourcing of those activities occurred in June of 2022. The first phase was for the insourcing of rail operations and equipment maintenance. That was included in our fiscal year 2023 budget, which is this current fiscal year. Now we are moving in fiscal year 2024 on our second phase. And on our second phase, we will bring in-house the right-of-way maintenance of signals, as well as facilities maintenance. That means that we will have in our payroll 76 full-time equivalents. Those are currently contracted out to Alstom, but those will become now NCT employees effective in late June 2023 and effective for the coming fiscal year. We have also, in the last 12 to 18 months, have been reprocured a lot of the contracts associated with maintenance of way and maintenance of signal and facilities maintenance, planning ahead of the transition. As part of the rail contract, it's not just employees that we're bringing on board, but as well, there's a lot of professional services that also are part of the Alstom contract that are now going to be directly contracted with NCTD. Also, if the board members recall, back on December 15, 2022, NCTD staff recommended the insourcing of bus operations, Breeze, Lift, and Flex. The board authorized the phased resumption of direct operations and maintenance of bus services beginning by July 1st, 2027, to include executing a contract modification with NV that will allow up to 3 one-year extensions and advancing procurement for the provision of certain specialty services and contracts for parts and supplies, subject to the executive director presenting a 5-year fiscal forecast that is balanced and at least 1 year prior to the transition. As part of this budget presentation, we will be presenting a 5-year plan. And within the 5-year plan, we have included the insourcing of bus operations and maintenance in fiscal year 2027, and we can demonstrate that we can be balanced in the next 5 fiscal years. Some of the assumptions that are also built within the contract, like I mentioned before, is the insourcing of these operations. From the ridership perspective, we anticipate that we'll still be in recovery mode from the impacts of COVID-19, but and we will not be fully recovered in FY24. We're also anticipating slower revenue growth. The FTA's apportionments for this year have been much lower than in prior years. So we have been allocated 1.8% more than we were in FY23. And also grants or revenues associated with sales taxes, mostly TD and Transnet, are anticipated to grow only by about 1%. That's much lower than the prior year where we saw growth over 15% in sales taxes. There's also a lot of discussions, as you're aware in the news, that there is a high probability that the US economy will be entering in a recession in late this calendar year. We also are predicting that we will face continued high inflation as well as high labor shortages in FY24. Some costs that also built in the budget are going to be one-time costs. These one-time expenses, what it means is that they will only occur in FY24. We don't anticipate that those are going to be recurring in future fiscal years. For the most part, they're associated with the rail transition to zero emissions, legal costs, positive train control, and various studies. So I will now be moving more into details of how we estimate our revenues and expenses within our budget as well as in our 5-year plan. Federal funds are mostly derived from Federal Transit Administration, FTA funds. Those are formula funds under 5307, 5337, and 5339. Those are allocated and apportioned by the FTA on an annual basis, and those are given to the San Diego region as a region. NCT receives 30% of those revenues, and MTS receives 70%. The funding from the FTA is highly restrictive to either capital projects or to maintenance activities. So FTA funds generally cannot be used for operations such as overhead administration, fuel, or non-maintenance activities, with the exception of the America Rescue Plan Act's funds that were part of the COVID relief package. Those are the only funds that currently have the flexibility to be used for operations. And in this case, we continue to have carryover funds from 2 years ago. So within our budget, we anticipate to spend about $40 million of the remaining $42 million that we have left from ARPA funds. CARES Act funds were fully spent in FY22, and those are not included in our FY24 budget. We also receive at the state level 2 significant funding streams. One of them is the State Transit Assistance, and the other one is the State of Good Repair funds. Both of these derive for the most part from sales tax on gasoline or vehicle registration fees. The allocation is done 50% based on population and 50% based on the revenues from the preceding year. The estimates for STA and SGR funds are provided by the State Controller's Office. Those are allocated on an annual basis. For the most part, they are estimates. In the event that state revenues are lower, obviously they will send revised allocations. If for some reason there's more revenues coming from taxes on diesel or vehicle registration fees, we'll get extra revenues. But if if they're lower, they will reduce our payments. But based on the estimates that they provided for this coming fiscal year, we will receive about $14.1 million from STA funds and about $1.9 million from state of good repair funds. And these dollars are pretty flexible. They can be used either for operations as well as for capital activities. Then moving to local funds, the major source of local funding for NCTD derives from sales taxes. There's one that is a statewide level sales tax, and the other one that's more local, dedicated San Diego region sales tax. At the state level, it's known as a TDA, which is Transportation Development Act. That money is, the estimates for those revenues are done in conjunction between the county auditor as well as the San Diego Association of Governments, which is SANDAG. For this coming fiscal year, we have been allocated $55.5 million for FY24. The TDA sales tax revenues are within the region are distributed 70% to MTS and 30% to NCTD, which closely mirrors the distribution of that population within the service areas. And population estimates. In this case, it's 29% for TDA. And we will also be receiving Transnet revenues of $19 million for FY24. And finally, there is another source of local sales taxes. We call them Transnet 8.1%. This is a dedicated allocation that's derived from Transnet, and it can only specifically be used to subsidize certain expanded services. The service from NCT that's eligible for this pool of monies is the Coastal Expanded Service that we started back in October 2021, and we anticipate that we will receive about $7.4 million from that source of revenue. Now, moving more into other revenues for NCTD that are not tax-related are fair revenues. We project our fair revenues based on our service plan. So we'll take the projected ridership by our different modes of service and then apply an average fare per passenger, and that's how we arrive to our fair revenue budget. Within our budget, we have also incorporated $1.2 million for the Youth Opportunity Pass program. That is a subsidy provided by SANDAG for riders that are ages 18 and younger. That program started last year. It is set to end in August 2023. It's only funded by SANDAG through August, but we are engaging in conversation with SANDAG to figure out a funding mechanism so we can continue the program through June of 2024. So within our budget, we have made the assumption that, again, provided the ongoing discussions with SANDAG, that we could hopefully continue that program through the end of the fiscal year. And then other sources of revenue for the district is as the host and also responsible for maintaining our right-of-way on both the San Diego subdivision and the Escondido subdivision. We collect maintenance fees and dispatching fees from tenants such as BNSF, Amtrak, and Metrolink. So we have made our revenue projections based on our existing agreements with those tenants. We also receive other ancillary revenues associated mostly with leases, permits, advertising, as well as tax credits from the LCFS and the federal CNG tax credit program. The federal program is set to expire in December, so we'll anticipate to only get half of the fiscal year. but we also get revenues at the state level from LCFS, which is low carbon fuel standard. NCTD consumes 100% renewable natural gas for our bus fleet. So, based on the LCFS program, the cap and trade, we get some credits for those, and those are additional revenues for the district. And then moving into more details, the buildup of our budget, we are now going to be moving into the expenses. We will see an increase in staffing levels related to the in-house transition of our maintenance of way, maintenance of signals, and facilities maintenance. It's a total of 76 full-time equivalents. The table that you see on this slide shows the headcount that we're bringing in-house for these employees. What I do want to point out is that it's not an increase in cost. These services are currently contracted out. The difference is that instead of being contracted out, they will become our employees. We are also within our budget. NCTD is conservative on how we budget for our payroll. We always assume 100% staffing, but we have never had 100% staffing. I don't think any agency has ever had 100% staffing, but we want to always be conservative. So we have built our budget assuming that we'll be 100% staffed for the fiscal year. Within our budget, we also have what's called capital labor. That's about $2.1 million. We are within the district implementing in any given year close to 100 capital projects. So any capital work that's done by employees, project managing, or any inspection, anything that supports a capital project, those are paid from the capital budget. So those are not included in our operating budget. That's about $2 million for this coming fiscal year. Other assumptions are as I mentioned earlier, with the transition in-house of right-of-way signals and facilities, the contracts with Alstom Bombardier will end on June 30th. And those are going to be agreements number 16043 and 16068. MV Transportation will continue to be contracted out. That's our bus operations contract and maintenance contract, a bus operations and maintenance contract for Breeze, Lift, and Flex. So we have that contract is subject to an annual consumer price index escalation, not to exceed 3%. As everyone knows, CPI has been much higher than 3% in the last fiscal year, but the contract is capped. So we can only increase it by about 3%, except some of the wages are subject to collective bargaining agreements. For the most part, our bus operators and mechanics. And then we have also added some positions within the contract that will support performance improvements, as well as a future transition to direct operations. Our liability insurance costs for fiscal year 2023 for 2024 are anticipated to remain fairly stable. In the last 2 prior years, we saw significant increases in our liability premiums. We anticipate that finally this fiscal year it will closely level off. It's a very minor increase compared to what we had in the last 2 years. Also, another cost driver within our budget is the fuel budget. We consume mostly diesel for our rail services, which is Coaster and Sprinter. And our Breeze fleet is, for the most part, fueled by compressed natural gas. And our lift vehicles are, for the most part, fueled with unleaded gasoline. So within our budget, we are making the assumption that the price per barrel of crude oil will be about $90, which closely resembles what we have seen in the first 4 months of this year. Right now, we're currently at $82, but again, we want to be a little bit more conservative. I think it has dropped even more further, but we want to, again, have a more conservative approach. So we are projecting that the average for the year will be about $90. Also, we have budgeted our CNG costs based on the cost that we've seen in the last 12 months. So it is pretty much higher than what it was last year. It's at about 82 cents per therm. And then finally, one of the largest items that we have in the budget is professional services. In the next 3 slides, we have captured about 75% of our total costs associated with professional services. As you can see, the majority are related to maintenance contracts, either, janitorial, plumbing, electrical, bridge inspections, bridge repairs, maintenance for our rail fleet. We also have costs for our San Diego Sheriff's Department, on-call security, faucet train control, and the study for the rail zero emission planning and pilot program. So there's more details in here. We also have environmental costs, biohazard, accident repairs, district-wide training programs, environmental services, software support and maintenance, camera replacement for stations, audits, legal services, etc. So once you look at our budget, we have captured about 75% of this table. It provides a pretty low-level detail so you can know what we spend a lot of our dollars in. So with that said, this table summarizes where our proposed budget is for fiscal year 2024. We are proposing total revenues and total expenses of $185 million, showing a balanced budget. The majority of our costs are from professional services, like I mentioned earlier. A lot of the details is provided in the prior slides, as well as materials and supplies. Those are, for the most part, fuel costs. And then the other large item in the budget is our purchase transportation with MV and our employees. So what you see is between FY23 and FY24, you can see that there is an increase in our payroll, but you should see a drop in gradual drop from FY22 to FY24 in our purchase transportation. You can see that FY22 we're at about $65 million, and for FY24 we'll be at 47. This is an illustration chart of where are most of our revenues. Like I mentioned earlier, the majority comes from the federal FTA, formula funds, ARPA, and then local sales taxes, which is Transnet and TDA. Those are major sources of our operating budget. And within the major expenditures, we see our purchase transportation, professional services, wages, and materials, which is mostly fuel. Also wanted to point out that within the board policy, NCT is required to have a balanced budget, and we have a conservative approach on how we estimate our revenues and expenses. So our revenues are, we are not aggressive on how we project revenues, and from the expense side, we stress test, meaning, like I mentioned earlier, we almost do the worst case scenario, like 100% staffing levels. So what this table summarizes is what we have budgeted versus how much we actually spent. So this is for the last 6 fiscal years. As you can see, every year since FY18, we have been able to be significantly under budget. So in FY22, we're under budget by $13.5 million. In FY23, we're budget under $22.5 million. When we have these budget savings, NCTD reprograms those TDA dollars for capital projects, because that's where we have a lot of our needs for capital. And then now moving into our capital improvement program. This is the proposed capital program that was approved by the NCT board in January 19. I wanted to point out that only the most recent fiscal year, FY24, is programmed in the Regional Transportation Improvement Plan. Everything else changes year over year. As you can see, and you can see because the numbers gradually decrease year over year, it is unrealistic to say that we're only going to have capital investments of $4.7 million FY27. As time goes by and as we start planning more our capital projects for the upcoming 2 to 3 years, those numbers generally get modified and they go higher. Board goal is to have about $50 million a year in capital spent. As you can see in FY24, we far exceed that. We are at $50.4 million. A lot of those capital projects have been funded with discretionary grants. That's another reason why our capital program changes year over year. NCD is highly dependent on getting those discretionary grants in order to be able to fund our capital needs. Also, one thing that I also wanted to point out is that NCTD, as a transit operator, we are, for the most part, responsible for capital projects associated with state of good repair. So expansion projects, for example, double tracking, those are not covered within our budget. Those are managed by SANDA. So this is just state of good repair needs. So from the capital budget that we presented to the board on January and where we are today, we are adding more projects to the CIP. These are the changes that we are proposing to that initial CIP. As you can see, for the most part, we have added significant projects associated with sprinter overhauls, as well as some minor projects for scheduling, HASAS upgrade, and some positive train control projects. But the majority of the add-ons that we are making for CIP for the next coming fiscal year are going to support our sprinter overhaul program. And finally, I know that this is a lot of information, so I'll be available for any questions after these slides. Finally, I am presenting here the 5-year plan for the next 5 fiscal years. As you can see, overall, through the 5-year, we are balanced, meaning that at the 5-year total, we don't have any surplus or deficit. I do want to point out within the funds allocation line item, the capital improvement program, those are the projects that we have currently identified. And then the future capital needs is whatever we have left for future years that we have not yet programmed and still can be balanced in the next 5 years. We also have other long-term obligations. Those are not part of the operating budget. Those are funded from net assets because those are liabilities that are already sitting in our books. Those are the CalPERS unfunded accrual liability payment, as well as our payment on the Sprinter debt. Those are come from straight from our cash reserves. NCT currently, 2 years ago, we have been making additional payments to our pension liability. So what we show here is the payments that if we were to make in the next 8 years, we will have our pension plan fully funded by 2032. So next steps is we will be presenting the budget, the proposed budget to our full board on May 18. We'll be releasing our budget document on May 31st, as well as the compensation the classification compensation schedule, our right-of-way cost recovery fee schedule, our service implementation plan. And on June 15, we'll be holding the public hearing and requesting the board to adopt and approve our operating budget and capital budget. I'm open for questions, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Sohail, do we have any public comments for this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. Does this board have any comments, questions?
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. On the significant expenses assumptions, professional services, there's a one-time expense for general legal services. What is that? Yeah, right.
I will say the question for your general
I
counsel.
know Lori's not here, unfortunately. Okay, I'll ask other questions. If I go to the historic budget actual, the budget between 2022, well, if you can look at the budget, what are the drivers of the increases 21, 22, 23?
So one of the increases, well, for the most part, those are one-time expenses, similar to what we have today.
Okay.
So if you look at the 5-year plan, you can see that our budget for FY24 is going to be much higher than FY25, because then we level off and we don't have those one-time expenditures, and we re-baseline the project. A lot of the expenses are related to project study reports, or like in this case, one of them is, for example, the rail transition to zero emissions, or like you said, like legal costs. So for the most part, they are professional services. I know that we also have services related to the some redevelopment studies for our coaster and sprinter stations. We also had, I have to go off memory because I know that we always include those details within our, I can go to more details and provide you that. It's a lot of one-time expenditures, but I know that we provide the listing in our staff reports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The rail zero emission, that's going to be going on. It's going to be going on for the next 10 years or so, correct? It isn't just a one-time expense for next year, but over the next 5 years, we're going to have a whole lot of expenses on that, correct?
So the board approved that agenda item in the last
Yeah.
meeting. After the operating expenditure side, we will more look in the capital phase. So once we are develop a pilot program and develop our needs, then it moves more into capital phase. A lot of time that happens, especially when we do project study reports for capital projects. From an accounting standpoint, you can't capitalize those costs. So you do first a needs assessment, and then once you identify the needs and you're ready to start a project, most then it changes to capital. And then there's much more flexibility to getting grants to support those capital programs than it is to support the operating part of the project. So that's really what we anticipate for the most part. Those future costs are going to be capital.
Okay, great. So Lori, you heard.
There was a question for me. I'm sorry, I was getting ready to have a coughing spell, so.
Well, now you
You're
might
ex-
have a choking
I
spell.
know.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. yes.
So the one-time legal expenses of 1.6 for next fiscal year, 1.68, what is that?
So that is intended to cover legal fees for outside counsel. We don't have, it's not all dedicated at this point. It's just anticipatory in case if we have cases. Some of it is dedicated to existing contracts, and then some of it is anticipatory if we get new cases and things like that. So it's all related to actual legal fees.
Okay. So every year we're going to have that though, most likely.
I think this year, it's funny because we had a long conversation about this. We have a lot of pending litigation that is going on right now. We're hopeful that will be resolved, a lot of that by the end of this fiscal year. And if it is, then we anticipate that our legal fees would be less in the coming years.
Okay, thank you. I think that does it for me.
You're carrying forward, I think it was 42 million in ARPA funds.
Correct.
What happens when that runs out?
So when you mean the time expires, I believe we have until 2029 to use those funds.
Okay.
So we will not run the
So
risk.
you don't see a significant budget impact when
No.
the ARPA funds run out?
Yeah.
And I had raised this before with the Youth Opportunity Pass program. Since there has not been, at least from Mr. Tucker's comments, an increase in costs to provide that service, why do we care about a $1.2 million sand egg subsidy if we're actually getting more people to ride? And you really don't need, since there's no increased cost, why bother trying to get sand egg to fund the program?
Well, you need those revenues to be balanced because you're providing those services and you're incurring the cost. But if you don't get that source of revenue, then you have a budget gap.
But if you have an increased cost, you're just putting younger kids on the bus or the train, it's the same routes, there's really not an increase in cost.
Right, but we'll be charging fares for that. Currently, we're not charging fares.
It's a successful program, so.
It has somewhat to do with cost recovery.
Of which is what, like 9%?
Yeah, so we can continue to have that rather than going down, I would think.
So you had mentioned your CalPERS unfunded liability, and it looks like it's 3.6 million over the next several years.
Correct.
But since you're adding 76 FTEs, does that not change that number?
Well, the unfunded accrued liability is liability that you have incurred for past service. So you will, so with the, there's the pension payment has two payments. One is the normal cost.
Normal cost, right.
And the other is a funded payment. So with the normal cost, right now it's much higher than it was in prior year. I know that there was a lot of reform in CalPERS. So the cost for the current employees is meant to be covered with current withholdings for employees as well employed. The unfunded accrued liability is for past service. So that will not increase based on the new headcount.
All right, thank you.
Well, you took two of mine away. As far as the lease revenue, the terms, When will those be renewable, or do they vary?
So leases and permits. So we have our chief of development here, Tracy, but it's multiple contracts. We have multiple leases, so they have different terms, renewal terms.
So that would flex in and out depending the year? Okay. And you hit on the employee cost. Said there would be no cost to us in boarding these additional employees. So as far as they're being paid off-site or through another contract, and that's including their benefit package, their CalPERS, their vacation, their medical coverage, and we are not covering those, or is that in the contract that we have?
No, so these employees used to be contracted out to Awesome, so all their wages and benefit were provided under their contract. So when we went back to the board back in 2021, I believe, to present the in-housing of these operations, we were able to demonstrate that we could be cost neutral, meaning that the cost of insourcing was going to be equal to the cost of contracting out. And there were a lot of reasons why, a decision was made. A lot of that had to do with better service, accountability, et cetera. So those contracts effectively end. So we will not be paying any contractor for these employees. So effectively, NCT will be paying for all their benefits and their wages. And those are included in our budget. It's a fully burdened cost.
Okay, so when you're calculating that for your FTEs, you've got, for example, your CalPERS contribution or their Cal portion, or however you've disaggregated. I don't know specifically, I have to apologize, but these are just more general questions.
Yes, we include all the benefits. We include Social Security, Medicare, CalPERS, workers' comp, health insurance, everything, fully loaded payroll cost.
Okay, and as far as the accrued pension fund, your obligation, how have you been paying that? Just for my own edification.
So we get the unfunded accrued payment does change every year. So it changes for every agency. It's always based on the annual valuation report provided by CalPERS 2 years ago. So it's always a little bit late. So that annual valuation report dictates what is the payment that you have to make in the 2 years in the future. So we have always met our obligation, but since FY 2022, we have been making additional payments with the goal of paying down that pension cost. So currently, that number that you see there is based on the valuation report provided by CalPERS for the annual, I think it's June 30, 2021. So what we do is they provide two tables. One of them is you can continue payment as you're paying right now. It takes you a little bit longer to pay down, or you can be a little bit more aggressive with your payments and paying that quicker. So the number that's reflected in the 5-year plan is that if we were to make that payment through 2032, our pension liability will be fully paid. But it changes every year. It's really based on the valuation report. And it, again, based on market performance, it will probably be higher next year because the market has underperformed in 2022. So every CalPERS agency will see a jump in that unfunded accrued liability payment. It will not be exclusive to NCTD.
So as far as us maybe entering into a recession here, is it wise to put more money down on CalPERS and paying that debt down? I'm not doing the math in my head. I'd have to rely on you. But based on interest and accrual rates, is that something that we might back off a little bit and maybe pay a little bit less instead of a little bit more? Is that I know it's a financial decision, but like I said, that's just a general question.
It can go either ways. You can see it from a standpoint, you can pay down your pension liability, but then you can also be strapped from cash maybe when you need it. A lot of our CalPERS projects are reimbursement basis, so we don't get those dollars advanced. So we have to pay those bills before we get paid back. So as a matter of policy, the board wants to have a cash reserve for at least 6 months of operating costs. Currently, a cash reserve, I think, is around $90 million. As you can see, our operating budget is $180 million. So because it's almost like in your personal life, do you pay off your car or do you hold on that emergency fund, right? Because once that money goes to the pension, you can't get it back. So I think we prefer to have those reserves if there's a recession, even more so.
That was my line of
Yeah.
thinking was, so next year you can take a look at how CalPERS portfolio has performed, what our obligation is, and potentially we not we may not be paying down as much as, we could just pay the minimum if we wanted to keep our budget whole. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
I have a couple questions here. On page 2, you talked about the phase 1 of bringing in the train and rail. And how are those expenses coming along compared to what we estimated? Are we on target with that? Are we?
From the FDA perspective, we're probably under because we do have some vacancies. So we're either under or on target. We are
Okay.
not over. You can see that overall our savings for FY '23, overall, I think it's like 13% over, was it like almost close to $20 million? So we are significantly under budget, not just for that, but all obviously other costs. Our fuel budget come also a bit lower, like diesel and gasoline kind of came down.
Right, no, I was
tapered
just
down.
talking about the ones that we brought in, or if we were on target for that.
Oh, yes, we are on target,
Okay.
yes.
And then on page 5, when you were talking about the federal funds for capital, I believe, and maintenance, we had a presentation recently, legislative presentation. Does that presentation relate to this, that some of these might be able to be used for for ongoing costs, but NCTD is deciding not to take that opportunity if it passes, correct?
Chris, do you recall that? Was this related to the legislative agenda presentation? So formula funds for FTA, the 5307, 37, 39, they can only be used for capital and maintenance. So
Yeah, so I think what you're referencing is efforts both at the state and federal levels to,
You're being flagged.
sorry, I wasn't in the microphone, to allow agencies to shift capital funding, current capital funding to operating. Those efforts haven't been approved yet.
Right.
And so nothing in the budget now reflects that. So it's potential, and I think we ultimately assess how to use those funds if that legislation is passed. But
Okay.
they are still working it out at both levels of state and federal.
Okay, thank you. And then on page 6, where you mentioned about if the state revenue's lower, is that going to come out in the May revise as to how he's going to adjust the state budget? Or do we know in time for this budget, or do we have to wait?
State, sorry. Yeah, so the May revise will give some guidance as to where we are. So later this month, we would see the May revise, and that will give us some guidance as to where the funding levels are, both in any legislative fixes for what is called in the industry the fiscal cliff. As you know, many agencies are facing operating shortfalls, and so there's a legislative effort at the state to address that. So that piece, as well as the formula funding, as you know from the prior presentation, last year the governor, the budget had targeted $2 billion. The governor came in with his original budget at $1 billion for the formula funding, and so that's what the May revise will show, is where in that between the two numbers they will fall for the formula funding component.
So this budget we're looking at today could change depending on the May revise when it goes to the board in June, correct?
So because we show a balanced budget, so revenue equals expenditure, so it will not revise or increase your expenses. They're still the same. And you can see that from our existing revenues. We still have the revenues today to support that. But at the same time, you can see our capital investments have a significant drop in future fiscal years. So definitely with those additional sources of revenue, we have at the district, we have over $1 billion with a B in capital needs. So those dollars could be wisely invested within a capital program.
Okay. Okay, and then on page 9, where you talked about the, that you budget for 100% fully staffed FTEs, is there an average that you look at for past years as far as you budgeted 100% expense, but do you go back and look at what percent of the FTEs we actually brought in? Or,
We could, but from the budget standpoint, our approach is to always be
Always,
conservative.
okay.
And then to be conservative, we assume 100% staffing.
okay, so it doesn't matter what the actual is in your mind.
And
Okay,
that's why
I
you
get
see
it.
that every year we're able to show that we don't spend all of it. We have budget savings, and when we have those savings, we reprogram those for capital projects. But yeah,
Okay.
we could go see back, but I think from our perspective, it won't change our approach to be conservative on how we budget.
Okay, okay. And then on page 12, where you talked about the sheriff's contract, is that a one-year contract or is it a multi-year contract? Like cities that use the sheriffs, we have a multi-year contract.
It's multi-year contract.
It is,
And it's
okay.
a dedicated sheriff staff for NCTD.
Okay. How long is the contract typically?
Have to look. Typically, I think it's about 3 to 5 years, but we could look.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so start negotiating it a year or so out, probably. Okay. Okay, that's all I have. Anybody else have any follow-up?
Yeah, on the state funding,
What page?
page 6, the STA and SGR, those are sales tax related and don't have much to do with the budget. Is that correct?
STA and SG, or the TDA has two components of them. One of them is the LTF, which is based on sales taxes. The STA is based on the taxes on, specifically on fuel, on diesel, as well as vehicle registration fees. So typically TDA, when there is like a recession or a drop on sales taxes, typically TDA is not affected as much because SANDA as a policy always keeps what's called a TDA reserve. So in order to diminish the impact of a drop in sales taxes, for example, in this case, we have developed a budget based on the anticipation that we're gonna get X amount of revenues. So if for some reason that 1% becomes a 0%, SANDA will have a reserve to make it up, so it doesn't impact the transit agencies. But then the STA is different because the STA is managed by the state, and those really comes from the tax on fuel and diesel as well as vehicle registration fees. There have been years where they have adjusted downwards, and there have been years where they have adjusted upwards. So then their number can change, and if it changes, the state will send revised estimates.
Those numbers don't depend upon a budget being passed per se by the legislature.
Well, the state controller's office will publish those allocations to all agencies within California.
Right.
What they anticipate each agency will receive. If for some reason those revenues will go higher or lower, then they send revised estimates.
But again, it isn't based upon, it's based upon receipt of sales tax. It isn't based upon
Correct.
the legislature.
That is correct.
Legislature
That is correct.
passing, well, they have to pass a budget, but, okay. Are we, in terms of, again, the assumptions that there may be a recession, are we being conservative in terms of the sales tax? Because obviously sales tax revenue may decrease.
So the current year revenues for sales taxes, those have already been allocated by SANDAC's board, as well as the STA from the state. All those future year projections, those come from SANDAC. So every year when SANDAC provides the current allocation of future years, they have their economics team that puts those projections. So we follow the estimates provided by SANDAC. So we are not inflating those numbers. Those are really, based on economic forecast. That's what they anticipate is going to be the growth in sales taxes.
So also as the fleet moves to EV, it's obviously not going to have a huge effect between this year and next year, but if we look over the next 5 years, has that all been baked in to anybody's economic analysis, or everybody just assuming that gas tax and sales tax will continue on?
Right, so, yeah, correct. So again, so as the economic conditions change, and as well as our own fleet, as we move into our hydrogen, fleet, we're gonna have to incorporate the cost of hydrogen. But again, Sometimes the federal government comes with tax credits. That's what happened with CNG. It had expired, and then they went back and retroactively put it back in, so we got that revenue back. So everything moves, based on, again, the composition of your fleet, the tax credits that can come about, the market pricing of fuel. So yeah, it's what we budget today is based on what the data that we have today.
So, as you look out 5 years, is anybody in the industry saying, hey, the gas tax and sales tax on gas is going to be decreasing because the amount of EVs? Is anybody looking at that at this point in terms of our revenue? So basically state grants, and some of the federal grants are based upon gas tax. And so is anybody looking at that at this point to say, hey, 5 years from now, instead of being maybe 5% of the fleet is going to be 10 or 15%?
Again, those estimates are the best estimates based on data that we have today. However, for the major driver of our revenue is really either FTA allocation from the FTA or sales taxes. So the ones that are really depending on gasoline tax is STA and SGR. Now, within our 5-year, because we know that those are more volatile, we assume flat. So whatever you see in the next 5 years fiscal year for gasoline taxes, that's flat. The other ones are, again, the sales tax revenues estimates, those are provided by SANDAG, as well as the FTA, the federal growth in that revenue.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And from Board Member Drucker, from an operating standpoint, our transition plan, as you noted, includes modest purchases at the front of the transition plan, and the goal there is to really understand the operating model for the new vehicles, both the hydrogen electric vehicles and the battery electric. So we know the costs, so that in future funding we can more accurately, as the fleet transitions over, have a better dialed in number on what the operating costs are.
Go ahead.
You just have to excuse me, I'm learning on you guys' dime. Is STA a subset of TDA?
That is correct.
They are.
Yeah.
So we have a backstop for TDA through SANDAG. So if our STA falls, somehow those monies matriculate over and make us whole on the STA side?
So there is a reserve for TDA, but there's no reserve for STA. So
Okay.
the STA is managed by the state. So if taxes on fuel go down, then it will impact every agency, because all agencies across the state will get revised formula allocations.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, this is an information item, so there's no vote required right now. Thank you for your presentation
Thank you.
and answers. The next item on our agenda is to receive the proposed fiscal year 2024 cost recovery fee schedule. This is also presented annually as part of the budget process and will be included as part of our fiscal year 2024 operating and capital budget to be taken to the full board for consideration and adoption in June. Tracy Foster, Chief Development Officer, will be presenting this item. Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Good morning, committee members. Just a little background first. As Vice Chair just stated, on an annual basis, the board reviews and approves the cost recovery fee schedule along with the operating budget. Under board policy number 11, fair market value is required for any incidental use of NCTD property, and the cost recovery fee schedule supports what should be charged for certain types of incidental uses, permits, and right-of-way support services. The cost recovery fee schedule was last studied 5 years ago. And so this year, CBRE, under task order number 13, was tasked with updating the schedule again. CBRE collected agency fees for 13 transit and public entities. Additionally, CBRE considered the consumer price index as well as real estate price increases over the last 5 years, and that resulted in a recommended 20% increase on all of the fees in the cost recovery fee schedule. So first, we'll talk a little bit about permits. Anytime anyone wants to enter into NCTD's right-of-way or onto NCTD property, a right-of-entry permit is required in order to ensure that the work that's being performed is done in a safe manner and is not in conflict with NCTD operations. The kind of work that's typically performed is construction-type work, on the existing infrastructure that might be in the right-of-way today, or installation of new infrastructure. And that is things such as overhead wires or underground pipelines. A work plan is required for all right-of-entry permit requests. And that work plan will detail what the work is that is being performed and how it will be performed. A submittal review is a review of construction plans for work that may be occurring adjacent to the right-of-way or within the right-of-way. So NCTD staff reviews the work plans or these submittal construction drawings. And the fee that is established for such review is just the reimbursement of staff time at fully burdened rates. So that means staff's base salary plus any employee benefits. And now onto incidental use. Incidental use is defined as the limited authorized non-transit use of NCTD real property. Example of these types of uses, as I mentioned before, it could be overhead power lines, telecommunication lines, pipelines or drainage structures that may run either along the right-of-way or under or over the right-of-way. Board policy number 11 allows for incidental use within NCTD's property. However, it must be at fair market value. The only exception to this under board policy is for any public agency where a reciprocal benefit to NCTD can be established. The proposed fees for these types of uses are established by a comprehensive fee study that was, as I mentioned, recently performed by CBRE in April of this year. So the incidental uses that are authorized by the issuance of a license agreement typically, and staff time for the review and preparation of this document is accounted for through a one-time fee, so the setup and administration. Fees for the various types of uses are annual fees and also include, as I just mentioned, the administration fee. And as explained earlier, you will see on this table that the fees for FY24 reflect a 20% increase from FY23. And these are just also the various types of uses that are included for incidental use. What's not included in the fee schedule is incidental use for, let's say, leased property, though that incidental use fair market value is established by an appraisal that we do on an individual basis. And the last type of fee we have is related to right-of-way support services. And those services include roadway worker protection class training, flagging protection for workers within the right-of-way, and utility markout and signal support. A new contract was just awarded by the board last month to Jacobs Project Management for the RWP training and the flagging protection services. Also worth noting that the flagging rate that you'll see here for FY24 will now also include a cost recovery for NCTD for providing right-of-way insurance, and that cost recovery is at a rate of $2.91 per hour of flagging services. With the transition in-house for the maintenance of signal function in just a few short months, the established rate that's previously was charged by Alstom for delivering those services for the utility markout and signal support will soon be performed by NCTD personnel as we bring it in-house, and will therefore be charging at those employees' fully burdened rates. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm available for any questions.
Let's see, do we have any public comments for this item?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, at this time, we're ending the public registration to speak. Are there any questions from the board? Go ahead.
So if I've got a pipe I'm leasing, I'm going to have to change, I'm going to pay more this year than I did last year. Is that correct? Or is it for new pipes?
So no, if we do in a license agreement with you, the license agreement includes language within it that it is escalated on an annual basis. So it's escalated at CPI or 3%, whichever is greater for any new agreement. So you've been escalated on an annual basis as is. This is for new agreements that are coming to NCTD.
And then also if the lease expires, I mean, these leases are not in perpetuity.
Correct.
They're but when they do expire, then they will be based upon the current rate.
If it's a license agreement for these incidental uses, yes, it'll be based off of the current rate. If it is a new lease agreement, then a new appraisal would be performed to establish fair market value.
Do we have any idea how much lease revenue we are making from these types of leases, incidental use lease?
Yoon probably has the exact figure, but I believe it's a little over $2 million.
So it's mostly utilities then?
Utility type crossings, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? I just have a couple here. Let me see here. So you talked about a 20% increase in the fees. Did we have any feedback from our, what would they be, users? Not vendors, users on these fees? As far as no issues at all?
It hasn't gone out to anyone
Oh,
at this point.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
because it would just
the
be new.
new agreements?
Yes.
Okay, so they
Yes.
wouldn't have comments.
But
It's
based
just-
on the study that was performed, the rates are competitive and in line with what other agencies are charging.
Okay, okay. And then on page 7, when, maybe I missed something on this, but just looking at the numbers, you went from 79.31 in 23 up to 141.82 in 24. That's, I believe, significantly more than 20%. Is 20% the average overall, or?
So, sorry, the right-of-way support services, so that is the flagging rate that's being charged by under the new contract, which is with Jacobs Project Management. So previously, Alstom performed the flagging protection services.
Okay.
And so we went out to bid and the board awarded that contract just last month.
Right.
And
Okay.
under that new contract, we have these new rates.
I
But I can
see.
tell you, it is a significant
Yeah.
jump. But again, in doing that procurement, we did an independent cost estimate, gathered information on what flagging rates are being charged elsewhere, and it's very much in line with being competitive in that marketplace.
Okay, so can you give an example of, I'm guessing most of these uses would be, say, along like the Sprinter line, or where in intersections somebody's developing near it and there's a need to go into our right of way to update or bring in or the utilities or something. Can you kind of give an example?
So the various incidental uses, so you might have SDG&E putting up new infrastructure, new electrical lines. It could be very much a new development going in that there might need to be the sewer lines or something redone or to connect in. And so that could be another type of use as well.
Okay.
Committee Vice Chair, I just wanted to point out the question that you posed about whether or not, people have had an opportunity to weigh in on this. This is posted for public review as part of the overall comprehensive budget document. I believe, when did you say that was going to be done? By the 31st of May, I think, the publication. And so there will be an opportunity for the public to weigh in on all of these documents.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no other questions or comments? Okay, again, this is informational, so there's no vote required for this item. The last item on our agenda is an update to the efforts NCTD is making regarding their business systems improvements. Katie Persons, Director of Service Planning, will be presenting this item. Go ahead, Katie.
Thank you very much. Advance, here we go. Okay. The business systems improvement effort is a multi-phase effort that tackles several information systems at the district. At its core, the effort has several goals related to improving district processes and policies around data collection, validation, and reporting. So some of those goals include leveraging automation and new technologies where possible to shift staff resources from time-intensive data cleaning to more strategic analysis, increasing access to business intelligence across the district, identifying a system of record for various reporting functions, improving data integrity, and accelerating the timeliness of reporting. The formal effort started about a year ago with the first phase, which centered around modal reporting process improvement and automation. This phase includes assessing data flows, creation of Power BI dashboards to automate certain processes, and the update or creation of standard operating procedures. The second phase was recently kicked off and includes an assessment of 10 key business systems or system areas. And so these two phases and the overall effort is supported by NCTD's IT consultant, 49 Technologies. Diving into the first phase, which focuses on NCTD's modal reporting obligations, FTA grant recipients are required to submit data to the National Transit Database on a monthly and annual basis. The FTA uses NTD data to apportion funding to approximately 3,000 providers in the US. NTD data and its associated tools are also used to support multi-year trend analyses and peer comparisons across transit providers. And given the importance of this data, phase one of the business systems effort set out to improve and update the effort across the district. So the methodology for the first phase largely follows this flow on the screen. First, we identified process owners and users via direct interviews with staff, that's both contracted and directly hired staff. We cataloged all systems relevant to NTD reporting by mode. We compared various data feeds and assessed potential gaps. We performed concurrent data assembly to identify system anomalies. We iterated Power BI data rules and validation procedures, and then we documented this whole process and documented future state policies and procedures. So to give an example, we have here one of several NTD forms on the left side of the screen that includes operating statistics such as trains in operation, revenue miles and hours, and total hours and miles. The primary system of record for this type of information on the rail side is our train management dispatch system, which provides generation and management of all mandatory directives, management of train operational data, and is the presentation layer for train management and control in our OCC. Other related systems include Maximo, the asset management system of record for rail vehicles, and Swiftly, which ingests static and real-time data for all NCTD modes and supports operations and customer service staff in daily operations. Historically, this sort of data collection and validation effort with this type of data has been very spreadsheet intensive and requires a lot of human intervention within the data. Now we're able to pull data directly from that system of record, TMDS, into Power BI and run and adjust business rules to identify anomalies or unique train movements that may deviate from the service as scheduled. So we're really trying to limit as much human intervention in the data as possible and try to capture that data directly from the source and have a primary system of record where possible. So each mode and its data systems are slightly different, and some are a bit more complex than others just due to their operational nature. For Coaster and Sprinter, we have progressed through the data feed comparison. We've documented validation procedures and have a new standard operating procedure in the workflow. For Breeze, we have several data feeds to compare and identify the most accurate system of record. We're working closely with the system administrators to identify the best source or sources of data to pull into Power BI and are identifying kind of the key trade-offs of each system that we're able to use. And for Lift and Flex, our demand response services, we're currently drafting an SOP, which will be distributed for initial review to the appropriate subject matter experts. Moving into phase 2, which is similar to phase 1, but isn't necessarily grouped by mode of service, but instead by business system. We have the identification of process owners and users via those direct interviews. We, again, review the current data reporting processes and identify any gaps. We review the requirements for relevant reporting entities, including NTD and FTA. We recommend new system configurations, potential integrations, or any data transfers where possible, provide recommendations for updated policies and procedures, and then document future state policies and procedures. So we have 10 key systems included within the second phase of the business systems effort, and they each touch a different corner of the district. Some are systems that are currently in place and have been in place for a while, and some are systems that are being contemplated and have not been executed via contract. So we'll click through the flows of each of these now. For the first set of systems, we have those that are HR related. We have a variety of system inputs from both operational and administrative staff that flow into our timekeeping system and operator scheduling and bid management system, which ultimately roll into the HR information system or payroll system. Related systems also include the recruiting software that the district uses and our learning management system, which interface at varying times within the broader system. Ultimately, the outputs from these systems are relevant not only for daily operations and finance needs, but also the district's general reporting functions and obligations. Next slide, we have contracts and project management related systems. System inputs include a variety of documents and approvals related to NCTD's procurement effort. NCTD is in the process of procuring a contracts management system that can provide better visibility and tracking functionality for all the various phases of our procurement system. This system also interfaces with our capital projects tracking system for status reporting and other NCTD reporting functions. For the fuel management system, we have a variety of operational, fleet, and financial inputs that feed into the overall system and are used for reporting and budgeting functions. On this slide, we have the customer relationship management software. Inputs include customer comments that are then cataloged and routed to the relevant department or division within NCTD. Each case is researched and a response is developed within the system, and oftentimes other operational systems are used for validation or context, depending on the case. Customer service then follows up with the customer, and the case is logged for reporting purposes and for future reference. There are 2 key systems that are used to log incidents across the district. This includes Conduent RTMS on the bus side and Vector Solutions on the rail and general safety incident side. These systems create data flows that are then reported to various entities, and the district has a variety of incident reporting obligations, including CPUC, FRA, NTD, and et cetera. The district currently uses Trapeze software for on-demand services, Lift and Flex, and recently procured Spare Labs as its microtransit software provider. You might remember that a part of the vision of that procurement was determining if a single software provider could fulfill the services of both types of on-demand services. So this effort will help to document the necessary flows and identify any potential gaps should the district decide to pursue that software consolidation. So there are quite a few systems that this effort touches. The priority systems span across the district, and their assessment and review will occur at varying times throughout the year. You'll see the ones prioritized in the nearer term are those that are related to the payroll HRIS system, HASTIS Crew, which is a timekeeping and bid management system, and the NeoGov/Kronos are also recruiting and or timekeeping systems as well. So those are prioritized in the near term of this phase of the business systems analysis, and then with the longer term systems flowing from there. And with that concludes my presentation.
No, Madam Chair.
In terms of implementing the systems, how can you tell me what the kind of the philosophy behind implementing these? And so it ranges from, I'll take the system and change the procedures, or I'll take the procedures and change the system. What is the driver on most of the, what is the driver?
The driver in terms of system change.
Yeah.
I would say that at the core of the interviews, what we're really trying to get at is how well the current system functions for the actual users, and how well each user is kind of aware of the varying functionalities of each system. So I think there are unique instances where we may be utilizing one system for one very specific thing and are not aware of maybe the broader kind of higher level view of the functionality of that system. And so we want to make sure that we're not missing any gaps within those systems where we could expand our use of it without necessarily having to procure a new system, but instead just kind of expand the use of existing systems as they are today. And so a piece of that might be education, a piece of that might be there's a missing link between two systems that are related. So when we say kind of recommendations for integration or recommendations for system configuration, we're really trying to have kind of that broader scope of view when assessing how well these systems are performing within the district and where they might be falling short.
Okay. On the contract management system, we still have Laserfish?
Yes.
And
That's
how's
one
that
piece of
being
many.
used? Is it Laserfish? Fish.
That's primarily a document management system within the contracts management piece. The scope of work, or the ICE, is routed through Laserfish forms for the varying approvals from project manager to chief to finance. So that's kind of one element of how it's used within.
So we're
contracts
still,
management.
so we're moving contracts to Laserfish?
Just in terms of improvement of ICEs and general document management. I don't know, Lori, if you wanted to add in.
So the question is, are we moving contracts to Laserfish? Was that the question? So we utilize Laserfish now for all of our document management, including our contracts and so forth. It's a little clunky.
A little clunky.
It's a little clunky.
A little clunky. A little.
And it's not Laserfish as you are probably thinking about, where you
Okay.
scan everything in and you're clicking and rolling through
No,
at the
that's
library.
no.
Right.
It's Laserfish versus
Yeah.
laser. I don't remember what the name of it
Yeah.
was even.
So it's the company name of our system, but the name of the implementer is escaping me. What does that stand for? It's ECS, but I don't remember what that stands for. And so it's a document management system where we upload everything. It's either in a PDF or a TIFF format or a Word format. We have a records repository, which holds all the records of the district. And then there's a shared repository where we can work in there, create contracts, create files, things of that nature.
So it's all online at this point.
It is,
Okay,
yes.
thank you.
So it's not on a floppy disk.
Right.
Well, it's not on.
When I think about Laserfish, I think about going to the library when I was in law school and like
Right.
scrolling
Well,
through.
the other one was the you'd have a sheet of laser. You wouldn't have that roll any longer. I don't remember what that roll is even called any longer.
Yeah, I do remember those from the library at
Yeah,
UCLA.
exactly. Okay,
Yes.
right.
Cranking it.
On the incident management system, are we looking to integrate Vector and Codient?
Not necessarily integrate, but, and we're working through this one now, so there are still interviews ongoing. With this one specifically, I would say we're really trying to better define the scope so that each can become a system of record for something very specific. So if there is the opportunity to have all operational incidents through Conduent RTMS, so both bus and rail, and maybe general safety incidents within Vector Solutions, it can more clearly define kind of the boundaries of each system and each have a more specific role. Right now, we have both rail and general system incidents in Vector and just bus incidents in Conduent. So the operational incidents kind of straddle both, and we'd like to have them within one system if possible. But we're still proceeding through the interviews in that, so I don't want to speak too early on the recommendations for that one.
And when you say interviews, you're talking to systems integrators or vendors of software?
The actual users of the system at NCTD.
Okay,
Yeah, so anyone in our operational department, IT, finance, whoever might touch each system in any way would be interviewed for their current use of the system and how they anticipate using it in the future. So things like that. In some instances, when we have questions for the vendors, we do ask them follow-up, but that's usually after we've made it through the NCTD interviews.
okay. I'll make a comment. My first question was about how to implement systems. And I strongly suggest that you change the procedures to follow what the system looks like, rather than trying to figure out how to change the system to follow the current procedures. Anytime you do that latter, you're going to run into trouble, terrible trouble, as vendors upgrade their system. And so it's really important that the agency take the viewpoint. We're going to get a piece of system. We're going to make sure it's the best possible system we can get. And then everybody's got to change the way they do business. Otherwise, it's going to fail every time. Mm-hmm. And I think long ago, NCTD implemented JD Edwards, and they tried to do it the latter way, which is change JD Edwards rather than implementing it based upon the way it works. So strongly encourage you to find systems and then change the procedures to mimic those systems. Mm-hmm.
So everywhere, all government entities are trying to leverage these opportunities with the goal of shifting staff resources so that they're not encumbered with doing these tasks. What kind of success have you seen as far as those staff members having their duties redirected or assuming other tasks? Because I think the whole goal is that we're more efficient, and then that way our FTEs can be utilized to do maybe other tasks that we could be more efficient in our hiring practices.
Yeah,
What's
definitely.
your general observation of that?
I think at least for the service planning side, to the degree that we're able to leverage those Power BI dashboards and kind of take some of the earlier phases of the data cleaning out so that we're not kind of wasting a lot of time going line by line through each incident, but we can have the system flag items for us to follow up on, has definitely cut down on the time needed to intervene with that data. And it allows for us to dive deeper into the data at a much more granular level. So where maybe we were spending more time cleaning let's just say ridership data as an example, we can actually dive into specific times of day or specific patterns that we're seeing and try to understand, like, okay, why are these patterns changing at a more granular level where we might have spent more time just trying to clean the data to be able to be usable. Now we're able to use it in a much more specific way. And it helps us in researching comments from customers or in trying to determine scheduling changes on our routes or frequency increases or anything like that. Once we have that access to very specific data queries, it helps kind of inform the larger discussion. And so instead of kind of cleaning, you're actually analyzing is how I would say the resources have shifted.
I just have one question. It sounds like you talked to a number of our NCTD staff who are the users of these. So do you ever talk to, as you're investigating new systems, do you ever go and talk to other agents or other companies or agencies that use their system to find out if there's any issues from them?
Yes, yeah, and that's a great part of having 4Nines as the consultant to help guide that conversation. They have a lot of experience with other agencies in the state and the US for these kind of specific types of issues. And so we've been able to leverage either their past experience or speaking with those agency members directly about use of the system and kind of pros and cons of each system. So that's definitely been an informative piece of this effort.
Right, because it's one thing for the system, the company to say, oh, this is going to
Yes.
work for you.
Yeah.
It's another thing to confirm with others.
Yes. Yeah.
How willing they are to adapt.
And a lot of these systems like the TMDS or Condo and RTMS are very common throughout the transit industry. So we've definitely had a lot of folks that we've been able to discuss those specific systems with.
Okay. Any other,
Yeah,
go ahead.
two more questions, sorry. One, as your analysts are looking at the data, have they found anomalies that are not explainable? In other words, it looks like the data is bad.
There was, for the first phase, there was a period of several months where we were doing kind of the labor-intensive data cleaning alongside what we were seeing in Power BI, specifically for the scheduled and service hours and miles on the rail side, just to see how close we could get the numbers to be. And I think it shed a lot of light on some of the either underlying assumptions that we were working with before, or some of the potential pitfalls of using like a Power BI system to aggregate all of the data together. So I think having that side-by-side comparison for several months helped us to really pinpoint specific train movements that seem to trigger these anomalies. So a lot of the kind of issues we kept bumping into were days in which maybe a train was annulled due to an incident on the system, and it would kind of have this like cascading effect in the data. And so it took us some time to really kind of play around with the data, both in Power BI and through the more manual process, to really understand, okay, when these unique but still somewhat common instances happen out on our subdivisions, how can we kind of tweak and tune Power BI to flag those in a specific way so that we know what's going on. And having a train annulled would impact hours and miles and that kind of statistics that we need to report to the NTD. So having that kind of parallel effort and diving into those specific types of operational instances helped us to kind of see what those anomalies were and see where maybe previous processes didn't quite capture those types of incidents.
Second comment, with Power BI is really an excellent tool.
Mm-hmm.
Appreciate you getting that. That makes a whole lot of sense. Is APTA or anybody looking at the current state of art of AI and looking how that may be applicable to NCTD operations or whatever?
Not that I'm aware of, but I suspect that would be a more common topic in the conferences that come up over the next year, but I'm not sure if yeah.
Just one note on that. The board it was 2 months ago, I believe, processed extension of our CRM contract, and that included an AI project. And the goal of that project is to look at the customer concerns submittals and look for anomalies or look for areas in which what the entry was done when the customer service agent talked to the person on the phone and how it was categorized. There might be an anomaly, maybe it got categorized wrong. And so we're actually in the process now of training the AI to understand our coding, the typical types of responses that we get. And so we are applying just one practical use that we're using AI currently in the system. And that was, we just started implementing that last month.
Yeah, because Microsoft is a little bit ahead of the curve and we're using Dynamics, it will be interesting to see, especially in customer service. The company I work with, actually, we created software that could tell a customer service agent what the person was going to ask next, number one. Number two, when to bump it to supervisor because of the language the person was using. So I assume that Dynamics would have that. And so in terms of customer service, yes, I mean, that's going to be huge.
Yeah, and that's what we're going through now. And primarily it's to say, to flag ones where the description of what was taken down by the customer, was the narrative, but then as it got categorized, it's like, wait, this sounds like a different type of concern than was categorized. Things like that. That's what it's doing.
The software to do translation of voice to text has improved so much that, because I assume a lot of the complaints are coming over the telephone, that we should be able to leverage Dynamics soon to be able to help us with that.
Anything else from anybody? Okay, again, this is an information item, so there's no vote. Thank you, Katie and Chris, again. Our next scheduled meeting is the regular board meeting on May 18th at 2 p.m. And this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.